So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rabbi Howie Stein. I'm currently the rabbi at Temple B'nai Israel in White Oak. Before that, I was traveling to Lima, Ohio on weekends, and before that to Newcastle until the synagogue in Newcastle closed. I'm originally from New York, and we've been in Pittsburgh for almost 10 years. So, given that there are a few of us, if you have questions at any point, feel free to jump in, and we can make this a little bit conversational. That's fine with me as well, and hopefully we'll learn something this evening. So let me pull up my slides. Okay, so the reason why this topic, sort of is present for me, personally, is that, I'm in the middle of saying kaddish for my mother, who died in February. 3 years ago, my father died, so I've been through the process with him as well. During the pandemic, one of my mother's cousins and my uncle also died, again, within the last year or so. So I've been thinking a lot about how liturgy, and I'll use that term sort of expansively as we go through the process of mourning, how does that help us heal? How does that help us move forward? So I want to begin. These are sort of commonly advertised. It's a theory from a psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on the 5 stages of grief. And this is, of course, not necessarily Jewish, so it does, have a more universal application. But I think it's a useful frame to think about how do we move through the process, right? And so she says that the first step is denial. We can't believe that it's happened. Then there's anger, that we feel that heated emotion at our loss. Then there's the process of bargaining, right? If you get me through this, then I will do X, Y, Z. Depression is part of the process. And then finally, we move to a place of acceptance, that we have sort of integrated that loss into our lives and moved on to a new normal. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, this is a useful frame, but the process is not linear. And there will be some moving back and forth, and even sometime after a loss, we may still experience any of these stages. Okay, so some of this I will kind of review the Jewish stages of mourning in terms of kind of a baseline, but also in terms of thinking about how do these things shape, again, our understanding, our mood at the time, our dealing with a loss. The first step is in Hebrew, aninut. This is the period from when somebody dies until they are buried. And our primary focus at this time is on honoring the deceased, making sure that the funeral is held in a timely fashion, that all of the preparations are made in terms of how the body is prepared, thinking about a eulogy, words to honor the deceased. And because of that focus, there's all of these details to work out, calling family and friends, et cetera, et cetera. The onen or onenet is excused from most positive obligations. Just again, that there's all of these things that we're supposed to do as Jews, but at this point, we cut mourners a lot of slack, and we recognize that there's a lot of work to be done when somebody dies. It's also customary for the onen onenet to avoid any pleasurable activities, right? You know, like on Yom Kippur, bathing for aesthetic purposes, using perfumes or lotions, you know, beautification and adornment. I mean, one tradition through the initial period of mourning is to not do laundry, so that if you don't happen to have clean clothes, you wear dirty clothes. But just to really not think about worldly affairs, but to focus on the deceased. And in terms of what I would call liturgical elements, right? I mean, the first kind of liturgy is actually an absence of liturgy, right? That we are not necessarily praying as we usually do. In some sense, I think that's because prayer tends to be reflective. We're not yet saying kaddish. We're not yet remembering the deceased in that way. And I think keeping busy at this point is useful because it avoids letting the shock of a loss overwhelm us. To be able to kind of keep going, to make sure that, you know, the funeral is conducted appropriately, and then letting the emotions catch up to us, to make sure that, you know, we can kind of, in some sense, integrate, you know, as we're in that stage of denial, we can at least, you know, kind of let that integrate over time, because we keep ourselves busy with the appropriate arrangements. Certainly, there are a number of what I will call, again, liturgical elements at the funeral, which I think can provide a catharsis, can help us move from this initial state of shock where, you know, sometimes we're numb, you know, we don't feel very much, to releasing those emotions, to allowing ourselves to be angry, to be sad, you know, all of that, the range of emotions that we will feel. Here's where we can start to let them out. One of those elements is the custom of placing dirt in the grave, that Jews understand the obligation to bury our loved ones literally. And so, you know, in some traditions, it would actually be that the mourners fill in the grave, or especially the relatives. And this is referred to as chesed shel emet. It's a true act of kindness. The deceased can never repay us. And so it's, you know, kind of done without expectation of reward. But there is, I've always found, a tremendous catharsis in this. You know, some families will say to me as we're preparing for the funeral, I really don't want to do that. And I will try to push them on it, because I think it really does bring home the fact that our loved one has died. You know, this is true. It helps us kind of incorporate that stage of denial, which may continue. I mean, you know, for some time you say, I can't believe they're gone. But that act of placing the dirt in the grave has a real sense of relief and release. You know, some people say, oh, you know, I can't stand the sound of the dirt hitting the coffin. But here's a point where it's okay to feel those emotions. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It does, I think, in the long term, really help with the process of mourning. Another piece of liturgy, El Malei Rachamim, literally God full of mercy, which is chanted in a mournful melody, right? It you know, it's not only the words where we are, you know, asking the God of mercy to protect the soul of our deceased, to give them shelter in the divine presence in the world to come, but the melody, and there are a number, kind of set that tone. Right? El Malach HaMim, Shochein B'Maromi. Right? It's evocative, and this is true of any of a number of places in Jewish liturgy. Right? Kol Nidre, the melody has become so entrenched that it sets the mood for our worship on Yom Kippur. In any congregation, there may be certain melodies which are expected. There are melodies that are joyful, as we sing many of the prayers on Shabbat, for example, or on Yontif, on festivals. When we're supposed to be happy, the melodies reflect that. And one other element, and this is not always done, but in traditional circles, there's a special version of the kaddish that is recited for a burial. This is actually the same kaddish that we recite after finishing a tractate of Talmud. And I think that there's a resonance there, that as somebody's life has ended, the sort of, if it's a parent, for example, they are our teachers. Their teaching in an active way has ended. As when we have finished studying a tractate of Talmud, not that we won't return to it, but that period of learning from that source has ended. Certainly, in both cases, we will remember what we have learned. They will come back to us. We will reflect on them, reshape it. But I think there's a real resonance there with the idea of losing somebody from whom we have learned so much. The key difference between the burial kaddish and the regular version of mourner's kaddish, which we will look at later, is a passage that focuses very much on the Messianic age. It refers to the themes of resurrection of the dead, the restoration of Jerusalem and the temple and its worship, and of God's sovereignty, right? All associated with the coming of the Messiah. And, I think when we think about this in the context of death, that, traditional Jewish theology recognizes that there will be a future time when the world will be perfected, and that carries with it that we will be reunited with those we have lost. I think it speaks also to the idea that they never really leave us. When we think about eternal life, I've always thought of it as the memories we carry, the ways in which we represent the people close to us to the world. And so I think all of that fits in with this traditional version of the liturgy. Okay, let me just stop for a moment, see if there are any questions or comments that anyone wants to introduce. Okay. So the next stage in the process is shiva, right? The Hebrew word for seven, which is the 7 days following the burial. It's customary for the mourners, right? And we've now moved from anunut to avelut, right? Mourning. So it's customary for the mourners to stay home, only to attend to the most urgent matters, right? Again, to remove ourselves from the outside world, to really give ourselves the space to experience this full range of emotions. And in those 7 days, the first 3 days are seen as more intense, which makes sense because we're just beginning to process our grief. And that's a period when, for many people, we can't accept comfort, right? We are angry and sad and, torn, our hearts are torn. And that's okay. And I think it's important to, that the ritual says it's okay to do this. It's okay to not put on a brave face. That this is part of the process. Allowing ourselves to experience that range of emotions is very important. And in fact, as those 5 stages of grief, if we don't process each of those stages, we never really heal, right? And not necessarily in constructive ways. So this is really about giving ourselves the space to let it all hang out. And I think that some of these customs, we might look at them and say, oh, this is kind of what we do. But I think there is a liturgical element, right? The idea that through our actions, through the actions of others, we are engaging with the divine presence. Part of that is, since we're staying home, we're not concerning ourselves with the outside world. Our family and friends are going to bring food over. It gives us the space to mourn. It's a mitzvah for them. They shouldn't have to be invited, but that, it provides that space. It's not only about the presence of those friends and family, but it's about them providing for our basic needs so that we don't need to think about them. Traditional to have minyan services at the house, right? Again, so we can stay home with our family, but, we don't have to go seek out the comfort, right? And I mean, certainly things are different. It depends on, circumstances. Certainly in the past year, much of this has been done over Zoom rather than in person. But the idea that when somebody is mourning, we go to them. We bring our presence to them. We don't wait for them to come call us up and say, I could use a shoulder, right? We just kind of go and check in. Right, and this is the period where we begin to recite the mourner's kaddish, which we will continue through the period of mourning. I think it's not only the words of the prayer. I think it's also, and it certainly has been for me, the ritual of going to services every day or almost every day. Getting in that habit that, kind of starts the day off. I'm a morning person, so, shacharit, the morning service, has always been where I focus. So for me, it starts the day off by saying, I'm going to acknowledge that I've suffered this loss, that I am not only praying for myself, but also for the deceased. And, it kind of anchors my day to say, here's a routine I've gotten into. It forces me to, get up and get going in the morning. Again, if you're sitting shiva at home and, a bunch of people show up at your house at, 7:30 in the morning for shacharit, it does force you to express your grief, but also to not wallow in it. Okay, so I have a question about whether sitting shiva is for immediate family only, or does it extend to cousins, aunts and uncles, grandparents? The answer is it depends. So there's an obligation under traditional Jewish law to mourn for parents, siblings, spouses, and children. Certainly, we understand a lot better now than in the past that sometimes those relationships are complicated and that can color the process of mourning, but that's, the relatives for whom we are obligated to. Which is different from the permission to. And, in many cases, sitting shiva may depend on the, particular relationships. Is this a cousin to whom we were especially close? For somebody who's an only child, maybe those cousins were like siblings. Somebody had a troubled relationship with their parents, but they had an aunt or an uncle who took on that role. And there's also even that can be extended to friends, again, to people who feel close, and also in situations where somebody doesn't have anybody to say kaddish for them, doesn't have, their parents are deceased, they don't have children, they're not married, and so forth. And there have been a couple of times when I've actually taken that on, of saying kaddish for that person. And by taking that on, it does imply all of these elements of mourning. Even though you're not obligated to, you take that on to honor that person. Okay. So when we look at the text of the mourner's kaddish, and it's not the only kaddish in the service, right? There are different forms of the kaddish that are dividing points, right? There's the reader's kaddish, which is shorter. There's, which marks the end of a smaller section of the service. There's kaddish shalem, the full kaddish, if you will, which is recited at kind of the ends of major blocks of the service. There's kaddish d'Rabbanan, the rabbi's kaddish, which we recite after study, the burial kaddish, or after studying a tractate of Talmud. But we think of mourner's kaddish, we associate it with death, with, we're in mourning, we're observing the anniversary of a death, and so forth. But it never actually mentions death. I mean, the root kaddish means to make holy, right? So on Shabbat evening or festivals, when we recite kiddush, we are sanctifying that time, that space. And so the predominant theme of kaddish is praising God's holiness, right? And I think it's important in that regard, because we're reciting this on behalf of somebody who's passed, but it's also reminding us that we're not alone. And not only in the physical sense through the presence of family and friends, but in that spiritual sense, that kind of inner, internal sense of why do we pray, to whom do we pray, all of those significant questions, that by reciting kaddish, we really remind ourselves that God is with us. We may be angry at God for the loss, but God is still with us. And the kaddish, I think, pushes us to remember that as we go through the process. Kaddish concludes with a prayer for peace, which, again, you could say, well, that doesn't necessarily have to do with mourning, but certainly is a primary value for the world. It's interesting that actually most of the kaddish, and this is true of all the different versions, is not in Hebrew. It's mostly in Aramaic, which, if we go back to rabbinic times, 2,000 years ago, this was the vernacular, in the land of Israel and in much of the ancient Near East. And, this is in the vernacular because that makes it accessible to everyone. Just as now many people may be able to read Hebrew, but not necessarily understand it. Aramaic and Hebrew are written using the same alphabet, the same vowels, and so forth. So if you can read one, you can read the other. But you may not necessarily, back then, they may not have necessarily understood Hebrew. And so by phrasing this in the Aramaic, which is not necessarily any more accessible to us today than Hebrew, but in its origins, it was about making those words and those thoughts accessible to everybody at these sort of breakpoints in the service. There's also a lot of repetition, both in terms of use of synonyms, right? Because again, a lot of it is praised and glorified and magnified and elevated and so forth. But also in some of the forms create a sort of meditative sense. Right? And so if we look at the text, right, we're beginning Yit Gadal v'Yit Kadash Shemerava, right? Magnified and sanctified, right? I mean, these two sort of elements that are somewhat different but somewhat related, but we have that verb form, Yit Gadal v'Yit Kadash, which repeats. And I think that that's one of the ways in which the construction here creates that sense of repetition, right? And we're talking about the God of creation, the sort of messianic aspiration that God will rule over all the world, and be present in the life of Israel speedily, right? Right, and so we have those intellectual ideas, right, of God's role in the world, about our desire to expand God's presence in the world. But there's also the various kinds of emotional impact that I've been discussing. Customarily, this second line is recited by the entire congregation. And also when we reach the end of a paragraph, when we say Amen, the entire congregation recites that. And I think that's important because we, the mourners, are reciting the words, on behalf of the deceased. But it's very comforting to know that we're not alone, that the congregation is with us. And sometimes when we're praying, if we're absorbed in our prayers and the book and so forth, we may not necessarily tune in entirely to those around us. Now, of course, if you prefer to sit in the talking section at Shul, you may be more tuned into the presence of people around you. But and that's actually one of the things I have found over the last 14 months, when so much has been virtual, that we don't get that kind of feedback from the congregation. Now that we're starting to have services in person in whatever way, it was really striking to me the first time I was at a service with other members of the congregation, and people were saying Amen, right? I hadn't really thought about what an impact that makes until last week, but it really does have that impact in terms of our mourning process, right? Now this next paragraph, this is one of the passages that really is meaningful to me in terms of the sense of meditation, of reciting the words, of being enveloped in the idea of God's presence, right? Because it is so repetitive. Yit barach v'yishtabach v'yit ba'ar v'yit romam v'yit naseh v'yit hadar v'yit alev v'yit halal shemei dekudasham rechu, right? And we just, it's the form, right? That it's the same verb form repeated over and over. But also, again, intellectually, it's all of these synonyms, right? Blessed, lauded, glorified, elevated, and exalted, honored, raised up, praised, it does, kind of give us that sense that, it's a rhythm we get into. In Eastern, some Eastern religions, there's this idea of a mantra, something you're repeating, you're getting into this rhythm of reciting certain words and certain passages, and that's here as well. I mean, this idea of meditation, occurs in the Jewish liturgy. It's something we repeat every day. It's certain phrases and expressions that recur that, again, can create this sort of subconscious experience. And I know that, and I mean, you could interpret this several different ways. I mean, for me, I can get to the end of reciting the Amidah and, not remember having said any of the prayers because, I'm in that state. This is a routine, and it's a way that helps me just kind of clear my mind, Jewishly in some sense, right? And then this concluding passage begins in Aramaic and then switches to Hebrew. Yehei shlam araba min shemaya, let there be abundant peace from the heavens. And then we switch the Hayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, right? And life for us and for all Israel. And again, connecting peace and life, that these are two elements that we can incorporate as we are mourning. That, life for our people, again, in the messianic sense, in the large sense, but then also peace, right, in that larger sense. Right, and then the last piece is entirely in Hebrew, and it's, again, a prayer that God will, bring peace to the earth. Shalom b'mramav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael b'imru amen. Certainly something that has application far beyond mourning, certainly, given current events in Israel. But it is how we conclude reciting the mourner's kaddish. Perhaps reminding us that there's, we have space to mourn, but that there's also work we need to be concerned with, outside once we start to rejoin the world. Okay, questions or comments before I move on? Okay. The next step in the process, right, is shloshim, right, Hebrew for 30, and it's the 30 days following burial, which includes the period of shiva. Now's when we are sort of returning to everyday life, right? We'll go back to work, and so forth, go to the store, start to do some of those things. It's, I think we've given ourselves the space to mourn, but now we have to move forward, right? We can be reluctant to do so. And I think that's why we get pushed. There's a delicate balance as a mourner between, holding ourselves back and saying, I need to process, and forcing ourselves to keep going forward, to not allow ourselves to become so consumed with our grief that we can't function. One tradition about making this transition is that at the end of Shiva, to go out and take a walk around the block, right? To kind of symbolically say, I'm now going out of my house again. I'm moving back into the world. Still customary during this period to avoid social activities, right? So we'll, go to work, do kind of the everyday business, but not to go to things that are joyful celebrations or social activities. Right? And again, continuing to recite the kaddish. Again, you're not going to have minyan at the house. You're now going to be going to the synagogue. Again, starting this, process of moving, between grief and, I use the term normalcy here. I would nuance that by saying that, it's a new normal, right? It's never going to be the same normal as it was before suffering a loss. And, as I mentioned, this process is not linear, right? So there are going to be times when, we've gone back to work, we have a couple of good days, people are very kind to us, and then something happens that reminds us of the deceased, and, we kind of, have a moment. Right? So, these different stages try to shape our emotional reaction, but sometimes it's not so easily managed. Then there's this period, Shana means year in Hebrew, which is the year following the death, leading from the loss to the first yahrzeit, the first anniversary of that loss. Again, gradually returning to normal. We may not completely avoid social activities, but certainly they'll be curtailed. What slowly means and what curtail means is very individual. It very much depends on the mourner and their ability to process a lot of these emotions, the relationship that was involved, the circumstances of death. All of these different things can shape how this process works. But I think it's important to keep that process going, to keep moving forward, even though we will have moments when we step back. During this period, again, we continue reciting kaddish for a parent. That's the traditional answer. Many people will recite kaddish for other relatives for the year as well. And we're going to move back and forth among degrees of grief, about finding expected times when we will be particularly affected, like at Pesach or at Thanksgiving, which families have many traditions, and there was always, when I was growing up, we always went to my uncle's. For Thanksgiving, everybody had their assignment, right? My mother always brought the chopped liver, right? This relative always brought the dinner rolls. My aunt and uncle, roasted the turkey and the stuffing and made dessert. You're going to feel that when the chopped liver doesn't show up at Thanksgiving dinner. And there are sometimes unexpected times when we're going about our daily life and we happen to be walking past a store that has, a clothing store has a display of ties, and some of them are, my dad and I shared a love of, shall we say, offbeat ties. Some of you have been my congregants and know that. You're walking by a clothing store and you see, oh, Dad would have loved that tie. You didn't expect that, it just kind of happened. And that can, trigger some of those emotions that you thought you were moving past. So again, we're never quite the same, but we try as hard as we can to, to keep going. And I think one of the really meaningful parts of Jewish mourning traditions is that, we have this period of readjustment, but then we focus on an ongoing formal sense of remembrance, um, which gives us kind of a space, right? Certainly we will feel that loss at all times, um, but that these are the times when we can formalize that rather than constantly being in this state of mourning. We mark the Yahrzeit, which is Yiddish for year's time, the anniversary of the death, customary to light a memorial candle, which will burn for the day, and to recite kaddish, to attend services, to make it a point of reciting kaddish. On days when Torah is read, also El Male will be recited for the deceased. And then Yizkor, the memorial service that is recited on Yom Kippur and on the three major festivals. So, for example, on Tuesday, the second day of Shavuot, Yizkor will be included. It's also customary to, on the days when Yizkor is recited, to light that memorial candle. And again, we are now reciting Kaddish as mourners and not as members of the congregation. And the service itself, can be a little bit customizable in terms of the selections of psalms and contemporary poetry, but it does include some traditional paragraphs of remembrance for different relatives. And that gives us a focus that we're not only remembering in general, but specifically to give voice to that loss that we've endured in a way that allows us to, again, continue on an everyday basis with what we need to do. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. So I will stop the share, and certainly am interested to hear any comments or questions that you have, based on your personal experience, based on a more general, response to what I've said. We've got, about 7 minutes or so, Derek. So certainly, happy to have a conversation so that we can engage with this material. Yeah, Zarki. You don't have to raise your hand.
Okay.
We'll choose.
I'd like to, I think you summarized this very well, but I'd like to add another component that most people don't experience today, and that's the actual process of preparation of the body. I've been involved with the Chevra Kadisha, and my late wife was also involved with the Chevra Kadisha. And when she passed away, I knew that her body was being prepared by people that loved her, had worked with her, and knew her. And that was very meaningful to me. But another thing that being involved in that with purifying the body and knowing what goes into it, and seeing the body dressed up in the tachrichim, the shrouds, it didn't really hit me until really a few years after my wife passed away. I would go periodically and just sit by her grave, and I always had just this image as a decaying body in there. But then it suddenly hit me, that's not what's in there. This is the body that was prepared and washed and put in the shrouds. And the shrouds for women, Laurel would tell me that when she worked with the women and they prepared the body and they dressed up the body in the shrouds, it was as though she was being made into a bride, all white and the clothes of a bride. And then it hit me that that's what is in this grave that I'm sitting next to. My wife's body, who's been made up, prepared, purified by loving hands, and made into a bride. And that's what's in there. And that gave me a lot of comfort to think of it that way. And we remove ourselves today from this aspect of the whole process, but it really is part of the process of grieving, part of the reality.
Yeah, and that certainly is a wonderful perspective. I did not include that because it's not something that the mourners themselves would do, that there is the chevra kadisha for the reason of, having somebody who will be respectful, but is not necessarily the mourner themselves.
I wanted to ask a question.
Of course.
I wondered, Rabbi, if you have any other recommendations of readings, liturgy beyond the prescribed ones that people can use during their time of mourning or whatever.
So there are certainly several psalms that are traditional, certain particular psalms like Psalm 23, right? Mizmor LeDavid, God is my shepherd, I shall not want. Psalm 121, Esa Einai El Harim, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. But also reading psalms in general is considered, there's a lot of material in there that is comforting, that expresses views of God. And so that's certainly a traditional answer. I mean, there's a tradition of studying, in memory of the deceased. Some people will take on, a tractate of Talmud or of Mishnah, or some other material. There are a number of contemporary poems. One that I find, and I'm blanking on the name of the author, is Birth is a Beginning and Life and Death a Destination, which, kind of traces the idea that, our life is not because we got to the top of the mountain, but it's because we made the journey, because we traveled in company with us. So there are a number of contemporary poets of that sort. Many of these readings are included in rabbis' manuals, of course. Not necessarily that you would pick up the rabbi's manual as a source of reading, but just that there are a number of these sources of traditional and contemporary poetry that are included in there.
Thank you.
I think we have about another minute or so if there are any other questions or comments.
Just to let you know, I just Googled for everyone that, and I am putting in the chat just in case anyone would find comfort from that reading.
Thank you, Derek. Yeah, it was in Gates of Repentance. Also appears in the newer Reform prayer books, and again in rabbis' manuals. It's it's interesting. It's not in the conservative rabbis' manual, except that I've made a copy of it from the Reform rabbis' manual because I find it meaningful, and many of the families I work with find it very meaningful. Okay. Thank you all very much for being here. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the evening and have the opportunity to learn with many of the other fine teachers in our community, and that you will have a Chag Sameach, a happy Shavuot, and enjoy the process of receiving Torah at the mountain on this day.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kol hakavod, Rabbi.
Rabba.